The topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Well, oil everywhere, but is the price going to go up? Is it going to stay up, or will it fall? I'm Dan Perkins.
The media, every time it aims at Donald Trump, it shoots itself in the foot. I'm Don Mazzella, and this is Two Guys from Verona.
It's time for Two Guys from Verona. Each week, you will hear from Dan Perkins, a financial expert, a regular columnist for the Hill website, and best-selling author, and Don Mazzella, a veteran journalist, author, and radio host, talking about things that concern you politically, financially, and socially. They will also try to give listeners a heads up on future happenings.
You know, Dan, you're always talking about oil, and you've been amazingly prescient about what's going to happen with oil. Well, we've asked an expert to come join us tonight. And the two of you should have a very interesting conversation, and I'll probably say very little. But welcoming us tonight and joining us with a very, very, I hope, interesting perspective is Erica Bowman. She's with the American Petroleum Institute. She's their chief economist. She comes very highly recommended. And Erica, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm going to start the questions off, but only briefly. I think that you and Dan should have a very interesting conversation. OPEC is meeting in a couple of days, and supposedly the world is awash with oil, but the price is going up. What's going on?
Well, with respect to OPEC meeting, they have different scheduled meetings, and this is one of their scheduled meetings throughout the year. And there's always talk about what OPEC's going to do. And certainly recently, at least the past year and a half, they haven't really decided on much. And I don't know that this will be any different.
Erica, this is Dan Perkins. I understand what you're saying. I saw one of the oil ministers this morning reporting that they felt that they were pretty comfortable with what was going on in the supply and the demand relationship in crude oil. And I'm curious as to, I wrote a piece for thehill.com over a year ago when I talked about the attack of Saudi Arabia against the oil infrastructure in the United States over Thanksgiving weekend in 2014. And they've paid a dear price, perhaps a higher price than some of the companies in the United States have paid. But given the problems that are in Nigeria and Venezuela and some of the other lesser OPEC nations, do you think OPEC as a cartel can remain viable?
It's an interesting question, and I guess it really comes down to the commitment of the members of OPEC, and I certainly don't know, how each of the respective organizations within that will choose to participate. I think it's hard though, because when you do have a strong disparity between different countries and different operators within those countries, it does become much more heated, and I think the discussions, it becomes more difficult to find resolutions within such an organization.
The OPEC nations seem to be divided because of the significant decline of crude oil and the dramatic dent or attack or structure or collapse of the GDP of countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia, so heavily dependent on crude oil prices. Right now we're around 40, 49. We touched $50 last week. Do you have, at the Institute, do you have a price target in mind of where you think oil's headed this year?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the American Petroleum Institute can't comment on price forecasts. But what we can say, there are different things that impact how prices move in any direction, both historically and in the future. I know that the Energy Information Administration, that's part of the U.S. government, produces their short-term energy outlook, and they're looking at prices that are in the 50s by year end. And so that obviously that number's based on, as you mentioned, the supply. How are different countries producing, different producers within those countries, the demand. Certainly, the end of last year, one of the big drivers of the aggressive price decline in the crude oil markets was the fact that predictions around demand growth in China and India and other developing nations were slowing. And so a lot of the expected demand was a lot lower than where they had originally targeted. But as time has moved on, now we're looking at demand growth in those countries, and at least from an oil perspective, whether it be crude oil itself or dry products, that demand is expected to be slightly higher than where expectations were just even a month ago. So it's hard to say exactly what prices will do, but you do have different things impacting how that price will move. Yeah. The other piece of that is you also have an inventory, and right now when you look at the inventory levels of crude stock, we're at 96-year highs. So that's another thing to just keep in mind of how quickly will we get through that inventory to get more closer to historical levels.
And you're as I understand it, you work at the American Natural Gas Alliance. Is that correct?
I work at the American Petroleum Institute.
Okay. I was misinformed. I apologize.
That's okay. I used to work there.
Oh, you used to. Okay, good.
Isn't it true that the two groups have come together into one organization now?
That's correct. That is correct, yes.
So to go back to my question, one of the things that's happened in this country, I've been involved with some local organizations who have been converting through a nonprofit structure, have been converting garbage trucks and taxis and limousines and buses and trucks from diesel to natural gas. And most of the stuff that I see about the generation of electricity, that conversion from coal to natural gas, that natural gas can produce energy much more efficiently with less personnel in a smaller footprint and far less pollution. Yet natural gas prices don't seem to be moving very much. Is that a function of an ungodly supply of natural gas in the United States?
We have a lot of natural gas. That is true. And yes, there is a bit of the market trying to figure out, okay, where exactly is the right price point, because we have such a tremendous supply. And producers have been very, very aggressive on the efficiency side. Like, they've been able to make leaps and bounds just over the past few years even, of reducing the time it takes to drill. I think back in 2012, it took 3 weeks to drill a well, and now it's taking 5 days. So now you can work with less rigs, drill more wells, and then the laterals that you're drilling underneath, which used to be, when you were using horizontal drilling, used to be maybe 1,000, 2,000 feet. Now they're, depending on your formation, 8,000, 10,000 feet. So you're also able to connect with a lot more gas molecules with just one vertical wellbore, because you're able to hit different areas from the horizontal direction. So all of that has really put a lot of downward pressure on pricing, which has been great from a consumer standpoint. And it is, I will say, at times it's difficult for the producers. But again, they keep finding ways to be profitable and trying to figure out, okay, how do we work through this kind of environment?
I have one other question for you, quickly, if I could.
Sure.
Given the Congress lifting of the 40-year ban, and as I understand it, there are some American natural gas companies who are in discussions with Western Europe to replace Russia for natural gas supplies by liquefied natural gas. Has the ability of the American oil companies to export into the world markets, is that a changer in terms of power and shift in the oil patch?
So I would say that it creates new options for the U.S. I mean, we've always been able to export refined products. We just haven't been able to export crude oil itself. With respect to LNG, liquefied natural gas, as you mentioned, that actually wasn't banned with the 40-year ban that was lifted. That was just on crude oil. However, there had been a bit of a slow walk with the Department of Energy in approving the commodity, basically the LNG, to be exported to different areas from specific facilities.
Right.
That has actually over the past year and a half, 2 years, has stepped up quite a bit, where there's been a lot of approvals at the facility level, both at the Department of Energy and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. And yes, you're absolutely right. There's been a lot of talk of shipping LNG to Western Europe as well as Asia. But on the Europe side, it may not always be about the price point per se, especially in such a low-priced oil environment. Because a lot of times the liquefied natural gas competes as a replacement for oil. But it's more about energy security,
right,
and really trusting that the United States will provide that energy security, where Russia has had a history of turning off gas when
right,
Western Europe really needs it.
Right. Let me ask you, if I could, just one more question, then I'll throw it to
Sure.
Don. I'm curious as to, because we have such an abundant supply, I saw a commercial where they were talking about engine oil being manufactured out of natural gas. I understand there's a possibility that there are companies who are looking to try and create, in essence, a gasoline product out of natural gas. I know that oil is one. Have you heard anything about gasoline or diesel?
So, in terms of you can do that. I mean, from a chemical standpoint, you can convert natural gas to gasoline, diesel. I think some of those projects and the talk of that was more, I think, more viable when oil prices were higher. When you have oil prices where they are now, the viability, because of the capital costs to make that processing facility to create those products is so high, you wouldn't necessarily be investing in those decisions today. Maybe you would, years from now, or if you're looking at if you have a view on oil prices increasing and you think that it's time to make that investment because you're seeing natural gas prices still being quite low, then you might still choose to make that investment and try and make those products. But in an environment where oil prices are where they are, that it becomes more difficult.
And doesn't it become more difficult for alternative energy sources to compete with a low oil price?
I would say it becomes more difficult for alternative energy sources to compete with a low natural gas price, because most of the energy sources, the renewables that you're seeing today coming online, are wind resources and solar, and that's really in the electric generation space where natural gas is really the competitive fuel. You don't have you have very few oil consuming generating plants to produce electricity, except for on very specific situations where natural gas is really the prolific fuel there that people talk about.
Don, we got about a minute left.
Just one question following up on that, Erica. And we're speaking with Erica Bowman. She's the economist at the American Petroleum Institute. She is the economist, according to my sources. Just one quick question. Is the consumer today better off than he or she was a year from now, from last year? And will they be better off next year in terms of energy?
Yeah, so I would say that the consumer is is probably, I mean, that's a hard question because there's a lot of things that go into that. I think consumers are certainly benefiting from the lower energy costs that they're seeing today relative to last year, and I think consumers will continue to benefit even if prices go up from where they are today. The fact that the U.S. consumer is consuming more energy that's being produced by companies in the United States is a big win for the consumer, because all of that capital that's being spent is creating jobs, is creating added value, is creating labor income for all of those areas. And that is definitely a bonus for the consumer as well.
Erica, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm glad we got you on, and I hope you'll come back next year and tell us some even better news than we have so far.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me.
Welcome back. You're listening to Two Guys from Verona. Once again, here's your hosts, Dan Perkins and Don Mazzella.
You know, Dan, some of the old-time newspaper men and women that I knew must be turning over in their graves by what's happening to our media today. You know, the more they shoot at Donald Trump, the more they shoot themselves in the foot. I'm really getting to the point where I'm disappointed with my fellow practitioners of the art of providing news. There is a unpublished poll, hopefully they'll be published very soon, indicating that the opinion of the American public about the coverage of the political campaign and other things has gone even lower than normal. A couple of incidences. As you're aware, this Latino broadcaster was booed out in California when she signaled out Latinos. And by the way, it was a School of Communication graduation ceremony, said how important Latinos were, and then took a shot at Donald Trump. We have 2 or 3 incidents over the last couple of weeks where the media has tried to attack Donald Trump by asking him trick questions, etc. And as you've been pointing out, and I'm unfortunately beginning to agree with you, he is taking everything the media has thrown at him and put it right back into their face, and in the process demonstrated to the American public that the national media really doesn't know how to handle him, nor be what it should be, an impartial deliverer of the news. We have Facebook coming out with these various trends, and we discovered that it's a group of 25-year-olds deciding what you and me are the main trend stories. There's much to be said. You know, you couldn't sit, in my day, you couldn't sit at the news desk and parcel out the news or pass on the news unless you had a lot of experience. And I mean 10 or 15 years out in the field. Things are coming to a sad state. We're also, by the way, coming to a state where we're getting unfiltered news that is not being vetted by older hands who can put perspective into things. And it was interesting, Mike Francesca today on his sports program of all places, the big topic of the day was the fact that a group of people were coming out and saying, why did they dare shoot the gorilla that had the 3-year-old baby in its arms? And he kept saying, can you imagine if they had not shot him, the gorilla, and they had killed a baby, where would it be? Yet people today are simply shooting off at the mouth, and we have no news sources that are putting a little muzzle into it and putting perspective in the news. It's a sad state, and it may help Donald Trump into the White House. Your thoughts?
Well, thank you. I'm going to talk about that in my next segment a little bit, but I want to bring up another example of media gone wild. last week there was a story about Katie Couric and an interview that she did with some people about gun control. And so they aired the program, and there's a segment of about 9 to 10 seconds after Katie asked the question to the group of people in the room, well, what would happen if we didn't have background checks with terrorists and criminals getting guns? And there's a 9-second delay where nobody in the room says anything. Come to find out that they edited that 9 seconds in. In fact, the people did respond, and initially, quote, they stood by the story. Now, over the weekend, Katie has said in a blog that perhaps they were overzealous in their editing. I'm not saying that Katie Couric is, and in her show on Yahoo, is a great news bastion of the free world. But what I'm saying is, we have another example of where the mainstream news media is manipulating the news to their objective, as opposed to objectively reporting the news. And I find it amazing that, as one person said today, as I was listening to the results of that discussion, Dan Rather got fired for manipulating George W. Bush's record, and Brian Williams got fired for manipulating his criteria and his experiences. I don't know whether Katie's going to get fired for her 9 seconds or not.
Let me jump in here right now.
Okay.
Dan Rather did not get fired immediately. He was allowed to gracefully, quote, retire. But as he said in the New York Post yesterday, I never retired. I just was forced out. And Brian Williams just got pushed off to a secondary thing. And if the reports are true, Katie Couric was on her way out at Yahoo News because Yahoo itself is on the block. Mm-hmm. But the only reason they didn't get fired is they generate too much money for their respective organizations at the time. And you know, of course, as I've often told you, Dan Rather went with the story while the rest of JFK's assassination, saying he was dead, while the rest of us waited to be responsible newsmen and heard it officially. Mm-hmm. So, you know, there's much to be said for acting rationally and independently, and there's much to be said for being responsible. In today's world, being responsible is not being rewarded.
Let me ask you a real quick question, because I know we're almost out of time in this segment, but let me ask you anyway. Are we in a situation where the revenue generated by the news is important to these network stations? Is it the networks? Is it that important?
Well, don't forget what really is CBS and NBC with Huntley Brinkley and Walter Cronkite. Their news broadcasts at one point were the most profitable half hours in television in terms of production costs versus revenue generated. Mm-hmm. So the answer, and it's the case today. Fox News is very profitable. If you're profitable, you can get away with a great deal. When you're unprofitable, then the chickens can come home to roost. Okay. Right now, the chickens aren't coming home to roost.
Okay. Well, we need to take a break. We'll be right after these messages. This is Dan Perkins and Don Mazzillo for Two Guys from Verona.
Welcome back. You're listening to Two Guys from Verona. Once again, here's your hosts, Dan Perkins and Don Mazzillo.
Dan, I really want to introduce your next one, because people should remember the job that you and your wife do helping our veterans with songs and stories for soldiers. It's a charity that I know you'll explain much better than I will. But the important thing is your next segment is tells a little bit more about the media, which I'm happy you do, but a lot more about you and a little bit about Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, Don. I want to just point out that today there was a news conference by Mr. Trump, and he was reacting to some stories that people in the news media were questioning what happened to the money in the various events that he raised money for veterans. And he indicated today in the press conference that they've raised about $5.6 million, and they're hopeful that it will go over $6 million. Then he went after the reporter who was in the room and just dressed her down by saying, you know, I've never been so criticized for doing something to help somebody that actually cost me money to do, because he gave $1 million. And he said there are people who are writing stories about questioning whether or not we ever gave the money to the veterans organizations. And he said to the reporter, look, I'm not only going to tell you where it went, I'm going to tell you how much it went. And if you'd like to see the canceled checks, I'd be happy to show them to you. But the $5.6 million has been dispersed, and the people that gave the money paid for the vetting of every organization to make sure that they were legitimate and that they were helping veterans who got money. And so the reporter really didn't have anything to say. Again, it was another example, as you pointed out earlier, where the news media had an agenda and they wanted to go after Mr. Trump to try and make him look like he was a bad guy, when in fact he had done his homework. He had all the data, he had all the information, he listed all the organizations that got money, and there was no response from the reporter. It is, again, these type of things that makes him a very unpredictable candidate. And if Hillary is going to be the candidate, where I believe she's going to have a great deal of problem. Now, I have to tell you about the Rasmussen poll that came out today. Just real briefly. I have to tell you that I can't imagine how the results that they reported are even possible. But 50.
But Dan, before you go there, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'd like to stay on point for this.
Sure.
Because I want to point out something to our audience. True, Donald Trump refuted what was said about him. But you know, there's a great story where people will remember the original comment and charge, but they won't. They will not remember the fact that he refuted everything.
Right.
I will be willing to bet you that 2 weeks from now, what will be remembered was the charge, not the defense.
Right.
I just want to say that because that's what's wrong with our media.
Right.
Now.
Yeah. Okay. So my point was that they said that 50% of the people who responded to a survey, 1,500 voters, thought that Hillary should continue to run for president if she was indicted. And they didn't say what happens if she gets convicted. But as I remember my Constitution, the only way you can remove a sitting president is through impeachment, not through the court system. But anyway, the point is that I think that somebody needs to ask Mrs. Clinton or Mr. Clinton, how much money has the Clinton Foundation give to veterans' causes in the United States? And I don't think that I've ever heard of any. We can give money to other organizations in other parts of the world with significant administrative expense, but what is that Clinton Foundation doing for the American veterans? You know, the suicide rate for veterans, Don, is up about 20% over the last 2 years. It's twice the suicide rate of the general public. Prescription drug abuse is almost 4 times greater with veterans than it is as with alcoholism. And so when people are attacking the idea that we should help veterans, I did a number of shows today because of our foundation. They wanted to get a different viewpoint. And we, the trustees of our foundation, have made a commitment that we want to have one of the lowest possible administrative costs of any foundation working in the veterans area, and currently our administrative cost is 0. All the money we receive goes to buy the players and provide the website for the soldiers to use. We take no salaries, no benefits, no travel expenses. Those are all paid for by ourselves. And I'm not saying that everybody else should do that. I am saying, though, that there's a tremendous need. And here we are in Veterans Day, and we have the American mainstream media attacking a person who's raised almost $6 million, $1 million of his own money, to try and do something to help veterans in need. And we have the head of the VA now last week retracting his comment, but the previous week he made the comment that the lines at the VA are no more difficult than the lines at Disneyland or Disney World. And they are, because the people who are on the lines in Disney World are not sick and dying and need help. It is a very, very real problem, and I just find it cynical, I guess, in my part, for me as an individual, to see these people attack Mr. Trump for his generosity and convincing other people to give money. $6 million is a lot of money and can do a lot of things, because I know we've done 7,000 MP3 players that we've given to soldiers, and we're getting almost 35,000 hits a month where soldiers, if they have their own MP3 system, can download the content from our website. But it's interesting that you look at the VA and their solution for treating post-traumatic stress disorder or sleep deprivation is to pump the soldier or the veteran full of drugs. And yet the doctors outside the VA will tell you that the soldiers can't really get the REM quality sleep that helps them heal by being pumped full of drugs. And we have a relationship with a major research and treatment center for post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. And the first thing he does is a drug test to see if they've been in the VA, what kind of drugs are in their system, and they have to go through a detox before he can try and help them. It's part of, I guess, our overprescribed society. We're oversubscribing the soldiers too in the hospitals and the treatment centers. And I have, having been a veteran and spent some time in a military hospital, I know it's not a pleasant experience. Not nearly as devastating as some of the men that I meet in the hospitals today who are coming home wounded from Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever. But I just was very upset that people were attacking the generosity and the concern, which I believe is real, of Mr. Trump for the American veteran. And I know it's an incredible organization to try and manage, and it's full of bureaucracy, and it's full of people who cheat and steal and manipulate the system, but it has the potential to do a lot. I mean, I did a radio show this afternoon with a guy in Augusta, Georgia, and he had just taken his father to the VA center this morning, and he said, it took a long time for my dad to get into the facility, but when he got in, they finally were able to help him. But it was very frustrating not being able to get in line to get into the facility. Have to wait and wait and wait to be accepted. So that's my high horse. Anything you want to add, Mr. Mazzella?
Well, I was going to say to you, nonprofits. If you look at the salary of the people who run nonprofits, then look at everybody talks about the difference between a CEO of a corporation and the lowest paid person in that organization. But if you did the same thing to nonprofits, I think a lot of people would be shocked about what goes on. There are a number of sites out there that talk about how much money is devoted to administration and how much actually goes for the work. And I think people would really be surprised.
I know we got to go to a break, but when we come back from break, I just want to follow up your comment. So this is Dan Perkins.
And Don Mazzella.
Two Guys from Verona. And go to our website, twoguysfromverona.com. We've got some stuff, hopefully, on our guest this evening and some other commentary. We'll be right back.
In this final segment, Don and Dan offer their predictions on what's going to happen in our world.
Well, Mr. Mazzella, it's that time when we got to talk about what's going on. First of all, we have the Federal Reserve meeting for a 2-day meeting on Wednesday and Thursday this week at almost exactly the same time that OPEC is meeting, as our guest was talking about earlier in the segment. And they're not sure they're going to raise interest rates. They want to wait and see what the jobs number is on Friday, but they definitely want to raise interest rates. And I began to look around and try and study what was going on and what's happening here relative to interest rates and deficit and everything like that. And I have to tell you that I had a dinner meeting with a client this past weekend, and she was talking about how confusing it is to read their brokerage statement. And she said, some months it's up and some months it's down. And I said, that's the nature of investing. Sometimes they're up and sometimes they're down. Over the long term, you hope it's up. And so I said to her, let me ask you a question. When's the last time you got a monthly statement on the value of your house? She says, I've never got a statement on the value of my house. So there's an organization called Zillow, ZILLOW.com, and you can go on and you can pick any house in the world, or in the United States probably, but in the United States by address, and they'll tell you what the value of the house is worth today, what it would rent for, and then they have a history of what's happened to the price. Let me give you a piece of information and why it's important that we get this economy growing again. In 2007, Don, the average price of a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, single-family home in the United States was $187,000. As of last Friday, Zillow's estimate for that same house was $184,000, and inflation over that period of time had been 15%. So you're not making money in your house. And yet we have had generations in this country, my parents, your parents, and grandparents, who bought homes because that was the way you made money. They didn't invest in the stock market. They bought real estate. They bought their homes. And here we have Mrs. Clinton criticizing Donald Trump for the idea that if there was a correction in the housing market, it'd be a great buying opportunity for him for commercial real estate. That's what he does. They're trying to now say today that his desire to want real estate prices to go down is equivalent to Mitt Romney's secretly taped 47% or 48% of the people that are dependent upon the government. I don't think so. I think people are aware of what's going on in real estate. I don't think they are aware that the fact that their house is probably still underwater. And but we need to put people back to work. As a show that I did just before I did this one, the gentleman was saying we need new revenue streams. It's not taxes. We need new revenue. We got 94.5 million people out of the workforce. We've got a situation where real household income has declined over the term of the Obama administration. And there's been no year that President Obama has been in office that the gross domestic product of the United States has exceeded 2%. We cannot make America run on GDP less than 2%. We had an April jobs number where Goldman Sachs thought the street was wrong. They were looking for 250,000 new jobs. The street was looking at 220, and it came out to be 160 new jobs, 160,000 new jobs. What nobody reported was the fact that 560,000 people left the workforce. So they didn't create new jobs. They had 560,000 who left the workforce. What this economy needs is to get, as Mr. Trump says, it needs to get growing again. We need to get back to 3 to 4, 4.5, maybe 5% growth. We do that, we're going to generate an enormous amount of tax revenues, which can bring our budgets, if we're austere, back into balance. We can begin to redeem the federal debt that we've built so much, $1 trillion in 9 months after they signed the tax bill. The budget's expected to be $500 billion underfunded this year. we're running out of money and we're running out the ability. And when I listen to Hillary and Bernie talk about all these new programs they're going to want, there isn't enough money in the wealthy to pay for it. So, a little rambling there, but those are my thoughts. Don?
Well, Will Rogers used to say, buy land. They ain't making much more of it. Mm-hmm. And we seem to be subscribing the idea that we can make just print money and it'll keep coming. Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right with everything you said. And the jobs figures, the old saying, liars never figures never lie, and liars always figure. Well, that's the situation we're in now. I frankly don't believe, and I think most people no longer believe the job numbers that are coming out of Washington. We're gonna one of the first things the next president is going to have to do is revamp the Labor Department. It's been moving along and lying along for a good 20 years that we know of. Which brings me to the point I'd like to make about what's going to happen in the future. There's an extraordinary amount of under-the-radar voter registration going on. I've seen some figures today that will make you happy, Dan, because as I said to you last week, the number of older people, the people of the 30s, 40s, and 50s that are registering to vote and has surprised voting officials from Alabama all the way to California. One of the reasons that Hillary Clinton rushed to California this week to campaign when she supposedly was closing out her victory march was the fact that her campaign is in trouble in California. It's in trouble in a couple of other states. If she doesn't break the 50% barrier in California, a lot of people are going to say, wait a second. I keep saying that even though she's closing in on the nomination on a statistical point of view, she is not closing in on convincing people to make her president. I think the race is still not over.
Yeah. Jerry Brown, the governor of California, endorsed her today, but not at a meeting. He did it in a letter. Public appearance endorsing her, didn't go to any of the campaign appearances that she had today. He did it by basically sending a letter saying he was endorsing her. And that music's telling us we're out of time. So this is Dan Perkins.
This is Don Mazzella.
And if it's important to you, it's important to us. And go visit the website, songsandstoriesforsoldiers.us. And for our show, twoguysfromverona.com. And we'll talk with you next week. Take care.
You've been listening to Two Guys from Verona.